There is a photograph taken in 1995 that most people who lived through that era will recognize immediately. Diana, Princess of Wales, sits across from a journalist in a room that looks like a television set, because it is one, and she looks directly into the camera with an expression that is difficult to categorize. She is not performing sorrow, and she is not performing strength. She is doing something rarer and more unsettling. She is being honest, in public, in a way that the institution she married into had never permitted and never forgiven. She had spoken to the BBC's Martin Bashir without the knowledge or permission of the palace. She had described her marriage, her struggles, her bulimia, her sense of having been abandoned by a system that was supposed to protect her. She had said in what became perhaps the most quoted line of the interview that there were 3 people in her marriage. And sitting there, in that television studio, she had changed everything. Not just for herself, but for every woman who would come after her and marry into what she was surviving. Tonight we are going to talk about 2 women who have occupied the same impossible position, one after the other, separated by a generation, and about what it means to marry the crown, and what the crown asks of the people who wear it, and what Diana's extraordinary and costly life taught the woman who would eventually stand where she stood. This is a story about survival and adaptation, and the specific kind of resilience that comes from watching someone else pay the full price of something you are about to undertake. Get comfortable. Let your body settle. Let the weight of your day begin to lift, not all at once, but gradually, the way the sky lightens before sunrise, in degrees you almost don't notice until suddenly it is different. Whatever is on your mind can wait a little longer. Tonight, we are going somewhere that is very old and very strange and very human. The intersection of love and duty, and the particular loneliness of living your private life in the full glare of public attention. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, a like or a subscription means more than you might think to a small channel like this one. It is how these stories find the people who need them. Now let everything go. We are starting in 1961, in a house in Norfolk, with a girl who was born into the English aristocracy, and who would spend her life, in various ways, both belonging to that world and being destroyed by it. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1st, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk, a house her family rented from the Queen. She was the 3rd child of Viscount Althorp and his wife Frances, and from the beginning, her life was shaped by the specific dynamics of a family that was wealthy and well-connected and deeply unhappy in ways that wealth and connection cannot resolve. Her parents' marriage was troubled, and it ended when Diana was 6 years old, in a divorce that was bitter and protracted, and that left Diana and her siblings caught between 2 worlds, between a mother who eventually left the family home and a father who remained and who carried his own damage in ways that expressed itself sometimes as coldness and sometimes as something warmer, but always as a kind of constraint. The loss of her mother was formative in ways that Diana herself described in interviews and conversations throughout her adult life. A wound that did not close, a sense of abandonment that she spent decades trying to understand and to compensate for, first by seeking love in ways that were not always healthy for her, and eventually by offering it outward, to other people, on a scale that the world found remarkable and that she found, I think, genuinely necessary. She was someone who needed to be needed, who found in the act of caring for others a sense of purpose and worth that her early life had not consistently provided. She was not academically distinguished. She failed her O-levels twice, which is a fact that was often used to diminish her, and that is more interesting than diminishing. She was not a scholar. She was someone who understood people, who could walk into a room and feel what was happening in it, who could make a stranger feel seen in the specific way that very few people can manage, and that is more valuable than most credentials. She was training as a nursery nurse when she began to be seriously noticed by the heir to the British throne. Charles, Prince of Wales, was 32 years old when he married Diana Spencer, who was 19. The age gap was significant, but not unusual by the standards of royal marriages. What was more significant was the gap in experience and in expectation. Charles was a man of considerable intelligence and considerable emotional complexity, who had spent his entire life under a particular kind of pressure. The pressure of being the heir, of always being observed, of having his purpose defined before his character had fully formed. He had had a long relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles that had not been sanctioned as a suitable match for the future king, and that relationship had not ended in any straightforward sense. He married Diana under circumstances that were complicated from the beginning, in ways that neither of them fully acknowledged at the time. Diana, for her part, was in love, or believed herself to be, which is perhaps the same thing at 19, before you have enough experience of love to distinguish the feeling from the projection. She was in love with the idea of Charles, with the story she was stepping into, with the extraordinary spectacle of the wedding that was being planned and that would be watched by an estimated 750 million people around the world. She could not have known, as she walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981, what she was walking into. She had not been prepared. She had been chosen. The preparation that existed for royal wives at that time was minimal in the ways that mattered and exhaustive in the ways that didn't. Diana learned protocol. She learned which fork to use and how to walk and how to dress and how to sit in a way that worked for photographers. She was not taught how to manage the psychological weight of constant scrutiny. She was not taught how to navigate an institution that had very specific ideas about what she was for and very limited interest in what she might need. She was not given the tools to survive what was coming because the people who should have given them to her had not fully understood what was coming either, or had understood it and decided not to share. The early years of the marriage were, by the accounts of everyone involved, including Diana herself, very difficult. Charles was often absent. The press were constantly present. Diana struggled with bulimia, with depression, with what she later described as a complete sense of isolation inside an institution that did not know how to help her and was not sure it wanted to. She was the most photographed woman in the world, and she was profoundly alone in ways that the photographs obscured entirely. She was performing a role for which she had not auditioned, under conditions that had not been disclosed, in service of an institution whose priorities were not her own. What Diana did in response to this situation, what turned out to be both her greatest strength and the thing that made her relationship with the palace ultimately irreconcilable, was to refuse to perform the role she had been assigned. Not all at once and not through formal rejection, but gradually, incrementally, through a series of decisions that each seemed small in isolation and that accumulated into something revolutionary. She touched people with AIDS at a time when AIDS was feared and stigmatized, and shaking hands with a patient without gloves was a statement. She sat on the floor with children in homeless shelters. She walked through minefields in Angola in a visor and a flak jacket, drawing attention to the consequences of landmines on civilian populations with a directness that was explicitly political, in ways that royal wives were not supposed to be. She did these things because she meant them, because the warmth and the concern were genuine, not manufactured for public relations purposes. But she also did them because they gave her a life that was her own, a purpose that the palace had not assigned and could not easily take away. She had discovered something important, that the power of the position she occupied could be used in ways that were not controlled by the institution she served, and that the public responded to this with a devotion that the institution could not ignore. The marriage ended formally in 1996, after years of separation and mutual misery, and the extraordinarily public Panorama interview in 1995, in which Diana spoke her own truth to an audience of 22 million people in Britain alone. The interview was a watershed moment, not just in the history of the British royal family, but in the broader history of what women in impossible situations could do when they decided to stop being managed and start being heard. Diana did not ask permission. She did not follow the rules. She sat in that chair and she told the truth, and the institution that had absorbed so much of her suffered what was arguably the greatest reputational damage it had endured in the modern era. She was stripped of the title Her Royal Highness after the divorce. She remained Princess of Wales. She continued her charitable work with an intensity that suggested she was racing against something, building something, becoming something in the time she had. She died on August 31, 1997, in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, fleeing photographers. She was 36 years old. The grief that followed was extraordinary. Not the polite, managed grief of official mourning, but something raw and collective and surprising, even to the people feeling it. Something about her death released something in the public that had been compressed by years of watching her live, and what came out was not just sorrow for her specifically, but something larger. A recognition of everything she had been, and of what it had cost her, and of how much she had given to people who had not always known how to give back. Catherine Middleton was born on January 9, 1982, 7 months after Diana and Charles married, and 15 years before Diana died. She grew up in Berkshire, the eldest child of Michael and Carol Middleton, who had built a successful party supply business from modest beginnings, and who raised their children in a household that was comfortable and stable, and, by all accounts, genuinely happy. This last detail matters more than it might initially appear. Kate, She was Kate before she was Catherine, and Kate to most people still had what Diana did not, a secure foundation. Parents who were present and functional, a childhood that was warm and grounded, a sense of herself as a person of worth that did not depend on the approval of an institution or the love of someone who was also managing his own considerable difficulties. She was not damaged in the specific ways that Diana had been damaged, and this would turn out to be important. Not because damage is destiny, but because the absence of certain wounds meant she had certain resources available to her that Diana had not had. She met Prince William at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where both had enrolled in 2001. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally in the context of a university environment where they were, relatively speaking, ordinary students, able to go to the pub and to parties and to lectures without the full apparatus of royal protocol and public attention that would surround them later. William was the heir's heir, second in line to the throne, but at St. Andrews he was also just a student, and Kate got to know him in that context before she knew him in any other. The relationship lasted nearly a decade before the engagement was announced in November 2010. During those years there was a breakup, and public attention, and the specific challenge of maintaining a private relationship under the growing interest of the press. Kate handled this with a composure that impressed observers, and that in retrospect was already evidence of a quality she would demonstrate throughout her public life, the ability to remain herself under conditions designed to destabilize. She did not give interviews, she'd make statements. She maintained her privacy with a consistency that was neither stiff nor unfriendly, but simply firm, a quality that Diana had tried to develop and found almost impossible to sustain. The comparison to Diana was made from the moment the engagement was announced, because it was inevitable, and because the engagement ring, the sapphire surrounded by diamonds that Charles had given Diana in 1981, made it explicit. William had asked Kate to marry him using his mother's ring, and this decision carried weight in every direction simultaneously. It honored Diana, it connected Kate to her, it invited comparison, and it announced as clearly as any statement could that this family carried its history with it into whatever came next. Kate was 29 when she married William on April 29, 2011, 10 years older than Diana had been at her own wedding. This decade of difference was not merely chronological, it represented a decade of adult life lived, of a relationship tested over time, of a personality formed by experiences that were her own rather than by the sudden imposition of a role she had been assigned before she was ready. She knew William. She knew to a degree that Diana had not been permitted to know what she was undertaking. She had watched. She had paid attention. She had done the kind of preparation that Diana had not been given the opportunity to do. What Kate did in the years following the wedding was, in many ways, the inverse of what Diana had done. And this is not a criticism of either of them, because they were responding to different circumstances with the resources available to them. Where Diana had chafed against the constraints of the role and eventually broken from them dramatically, Kate worked within them with a patience and a consistency that the institution found considerably less threatening. She dressed impeccably and appropriately. She performed her engagements with warmth and with genuine interest in the people she met. She gave very few interviews, and when she gave them, she said nothing that could be used against her or against the family. She was, by the standards the palace had always wanted, easier. This has been read in various ways by various observers. Some have found in it evidence of a lack of authenticity, a performance of compliance that reveals nothing of the person underneath. Others have found in it evidence of wisdom, of someone who understood the rules of the game she was playing, and had decided to play it on its own terms, rather than fighting a battle she knew, from Diana's example, she could not win in the way Diana had tried to win it. The truth is probably somewhere between these readings, and it is also probably more complicated than either of them suggests. Kate is not a cipher. She has opinions and interests and a personality that expresses itself in the constrained vocabulary of royal public life, with more consistency than casual observers often notice. Her work on early childhood development, the cause she has made genuinely her own, the area where she has developed real expertise in real relationships and real impact, is not a performance of interest. It is interest, expressed through the channels available to her. She is someone who has learned to work within a container that is very constraining, and who has found within those constraints things that are genuinely hers. There is a question that sits underneath the comparison between Diana and Kate that is worth addressing directly. Is Kate's approach, the patience, the compliance, the working within the system, a form of success that Diana's approach was not? And the honest answer is that it depends entirely on what you think success means in this context. Kate has survived. She has maintained her marriage and her family and her position and her health in ways that Diana did not manage to do, and this matters. But Diana changed things. Diana made it impossible to look at the monarchy in quite the same way again. She did this at enormous personal cost, and she did not get to see the consequences of what she had changed, because she died before they fully emerged. The relationship between the two women is not simply one of predecessor and successor. It is also, in some sense, one of teacher and student. Even though Diana died when William was 15 and Kate had not yet met him, even though the teaching was done entirely without intention, through the public record of a life that was observed more thoroughly than almost any life in history. Kate watched Diana the way anyone growing up in Britain in the 1980s and 1990s watched Diana, through the newspapers and the television and the cultural atmosphere that Diana permeated so thoroughly that it is impossible to separate her from the era she inhabited. And what Kate took from that watching, what she absorbed and what she learned, and what she decided to do differently, is one of the more interesting and largely unexamined stories of modern British life. Diana taught Kate, by negative example, what happens when you fight the institution on its own terms and without allies. Diana was outmaneuvered repeatedly by the palace machinery, by advisors who served the family rather than her, by a press that alternately lionized and destroyed her depending on what sold. She was isolated in ways that made effective resistance almost impossible. Kate, watching this, seems to have drawn a different set of conclusions. That the way to maintain yourself inside this institution is not to confront it head-on, but to find within it the spaces where you can be genuinely yourself, and to inhabit those spaces fully while giving the institution everything else it requires. This is not a comfortable strategy to admire uncritically, because it involves a degree of accommodation that many people would find difficult or wrong. But it is a strategy that has allowed Kate to do something Diana was not able to do, to build a stable life, to raise her children, George, Charlotte, Louis, in something approaching normalcy, to maintain her marriage through difficulties that the press has been eager to amplify and that she has consistently declined to address publicly. Whether this stability is worth what it costs is a question that Kate herself has presumably answered, in private, in ways that the rest of us are not privy to. The illness that Kate disclosed in 2024, the cancer diagnosis that she announced publicly after weeks of speculation about her absence from public life, was a moment that brought the comparison with Diana into sharp focus in a new way. Diana had struggled with her health in secret and then had her secrets exposed. Kate managed her own health crisis with a combination of privacy and disclosure that was much more controlled. She chose when to speak and what to say. She maintained the narrative rather than losing it. She emerged from the experience on her own terms in ways that Diana never quite managed to do. The cancer was real and serious and frightening, and her handling of it was also, in its way, a demonstration of how much had changed in the 30 years since Diana's Panorama interview, and of how much Kate had learned from the woman who had not been able to control her own story. There is a version of this story that is about two women and one impossible institution, and another version that is about what women can and cannot do when they are placed inside structures that were not built for them, and that have very clear ideas about what they are for. Both versions are true, and neither is complete. Diana and Kate are individuals, specific people with specific histories and specific characters, and they are also symbols, which is what the institution requires them to be and what the public makes of them whether they want it or not. The tension between the person and the symbol is something both women have had to navigate, and they have navigated it differently, with different tools and different costs and different outcomes. What Diana gave the world was a demonstration that the person inside the symbol is real, that behind the tiara and the protocol and the carefully managed appearances is someone who bleeds and grieves and makes mistakes and needs things that institutions are not always equipped to provide. This demonstration cost her everything, and what Kate has done, in the years since Diana died and since she herself stepped into the role that Diana's death had, in some ways made available, is to inhabit the symbol without disappearing into it, to be the princess the institution needs while remaining in the spaces that are available to her, the person she actually is. Whether she has succeeded at this, whether it is even possible to succeed at it in any full sense, or whether the attempt always involves compromises that make the concept of success somewhat complicated, is a question without a clean answer. What is clear is that she has tried, and that she has tried in full knowledge of what the failure to try had cost the woman who came before her. Diana is present in Kate's life, not as a ghost or a burden, but as a kind of evidence. Evidence of what the role demands and what it can take. Evidence that the person inside the role matters, and that protecting that person is worth the effort. Evidence that love and care and genuine human connection are not incompatible with the performance of royal duty, but are, in fact, what gives that duty its meaning. The crown never fits is a phrase that captures something true about what both of these women have experienced. That the institution of the monarchy asks its members to conform to a shape that is not quite the shape of any actual human being. That the adjustment is always costly and always partial. That something is always lost in the wearing of it. Diana lost herself in ways that she spent her whole life trying to recover from, and never quite did. Kate has managed the wearing more skillfully, more strategically, with more support and more self-knowledge than Diana had available. But the crown is still heavy. The expectations are still impossible. The space between the person and the role is still a space where real things happen. Real things are sacrificed. Real choices are made that the public sees only the outcome of, and not the cost. That is all for tonight. I hope this gave you something to think about. The story of two women, one institution, and the different ways that people find to survive in positions that were not designed with survival in mind. These are stories about dignity and compromise, and the specific courage it takes to remain yourself when everything around you is asking you to be something else. If you made it this far, thank you. A like, a comment, a subscription, all of it matters more than you might think for a small channel like this one. It is how these stories reach the people they are meant for. Sleep well. The crown is heavy, but tonight you don't have to wear it. I will see you in the next one. The monarchy that Diana married into in 1981 was one that had spent decades carefully managing its relationship with the public, cultivating a particular image of dignity and continuity, and service that had survived the abdication crisis of 1936, the austerity of the post-war years, and the social upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s. It had done this primarily through control of access, control of narrative, control of what was shown and what was withheld. The Queen's press office operated on the principle that the best strategy was usually silence, that the monarchy was most secure when it was most mysterious, that the less the public knew about what happened behind the palace doors, the better for the institution. Diana disrupted this logic irrevocably. Not because she intended to. Her early years suggest someone who was trying very hard to do what was expected of her, to fulfill the role she had been given as well as she possibly could, but because the role was incompatible with her personality in ways that eventually became impossible to contain. She was someone who needed connection, who thrived on human warmth and reciprocity, who found the formal distances of royal life genuinely painful rather than merely inconvenient. She was someone who could not maintain a face that was not her own face, at least not indefinitely, at least not under the kind of pressure that was being applied to her. The press played a role in this that is complicated, and that the press itself has not always been honest about. The tabloid newspapers of 1980s and 1990s, Britain were in the middle of their most powerful period. Their circulation figures were enormous, their influence on public opinion was real, and their appetite for stories about Diana was essentially insatiable. They had helped create her as a public figure, had participated in the construction of the image of the shy, beautiful, slightly awkward young woman who had captured the heart of the Prince of Wales, and then they had turned on her with a thoroughness that reflected the extent to which she had become their property, or so they believed, and the extent to which she had begun to exceed their control. Diana understood the press in ways that the palace did not fully appreciate. She had an intuitive grasp of what made a photograph, what made a story, what the public responded to and why. She used this understanding sometimes with considerable sophistication, placing herself in situations that generated the images and the narrative she wanted, building relationships with photographers and editors, managing her own coverage in ways that the palace found alarming because they had not authorized it. She was, in this sense, ahead of her time, a celebrity in an era before celebrities routinely managed their own brands, an influencer before the concept existed. But her relationship with the media was never comfortable, and never fully under her control, because the media had its own interests that did not coincide with hers. They needed her to be glamorous and troubled and accessible and mysterious simultaneously, and these requirements were contradictory in ways that meant whatever she gave them was never quite enough. They built her up, and they tore her down, and they built her up again, and the cycle was exhausting and ultimately fatal in the most literal sense. She died in a car fleeing photographers in a tunnel in Paris. Kate has had a fundamentally different relationship with the press, partly because the world has changed, and partly because she has been more careful and more strategic from the beginning. The legal actions that William and Kate have taken against publications that have invaded their privacy, the successful lawsuit over topless photographs taken of Kate in France in 2012, the ongoing legal battles over phone hacking, have established boundaries that Diana was never able to establish, and that the Palace of Diana's era would not have known how to establish on her behalf. The law has changed, the culture around privacy has changed, and Kate has been willing to use both. She has also been willing to use social media in ways that Diana could not have been, because the platforms did not exist. The carefully curated Instagram and Twitter presence of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the birthday photographs, the official engagements, the occasional glimpses of family life that feel natural without being genuinely candid, is a form of managed access that gives the public what it wants while controlling what it sees with a precision that the press conference and photographer model of Diana's era never allowed. Kate and her team have understood that if you give people enough, they stop looking quite so hard for what you haven't given them. The question of what Kate thinks about Diana, what she has made of the woman whose ring she wears, whose husband she has loved for 2 decades, whose children she helps to raise, whose absence has shaped the family she has joined in ways both visible and invisible, is one that she has never addressed publicly with any directness. And this reticence is itself revealing. The comparison is always there. It is in every photograph and every article and every occasion where William stands at a podium and someone in the room is thinking of another woman who stood beside him in another time. William's relationship with his mother's memory is complex and has evolved visibly over the years. He went through a period in his 20s where he rarely spoke of her publicly, as if the grief was too close and the public attention too intrusive to allow any authentic expression of it. He has become, in his 30s and 40s, someone who speaks of Diana with more ease and more openness, who has allowed the public to see something of what she meant to him and what her loss has cost, who has used her memory in service of the mental health causes he has championed. Kate has been part of this evolution, not as the person who has replaced Diana, because no one replaces anyone, but as the person who has helped create the environment in which it became possible. The way Kate has handled the question of Diana in relation to her own children is one of the things about her that inspires genuine admiration from people who observe her carefully. George and Charlotte and Louis have grown up knowing who their grandmother was, knowing that she mattered and was loved, knowing something of her story, not in the full complicated adult version, which is too much for children, but in the essential version, that she was a remarkable woman who did remarkable things and who loved their father very much. Kate has not erased Diana. She has made space for her within the family in ways that respect both the loss and the living. There is a generation of women who grew up with Diana as a kind of cultural reference point, who watched her on television and read about her in magazines and understood, in the way that children understand things without necessarily being able to articulate them, that this woman was something important, that what was happening to her mattered, that the spectacle of her was not just entertainment but something more serious and more instructive. Kate belongs to this generation. She was 16 when Diana died, old enough to have absorbed the meaning of Diana's life and death in ways that shaped her understanding of what she was getting into when she fell in love with the sun. The grief that swept Britain in the days after Diana's death in August 1997 was, as many observers have noted, extraordinary in ways that went beyond the usual responses to celebrity deaths. People who had never met her left flowers outside Kensington Palace. People who rarely cried found themselves crying. The week of official mourning felt inadequate to the volume of emotion it was supposed to contain, and the Queen was criticized for remaining in Scotland, for maintaining the formal distances that had always characterized the monarchy's relationship with public feeling, in the face of a public that was feeling something it did not have the usual containers for. The funeral, on September 6, 1997, was watched by 2.5 billion people worldwide. Elton John sang a rewritten Candle in the Wind. Earl Spencer gave a eulogy that included implicit criticism of the press and explicit criticism of the family that had, in his view, failed to protect his sister. William and Harry walked behind the coffin, 14 and 12 years old, in a procession that those who witnessed it described as the saddest thing they had ever seen. The image of those two boys walking in the September sunshine, trying to be composed in the way they had been taught to be composed, carrying more than any child should have to carry. This is an image that has not faded. Kate has lived with this image for a long time because it is part of the person she loves and the family she has joined. She did not meet William until he was 19, and she was 20, but the boy in that photograph was in some important sense still present in the man she was getting to know, and understanding that was part of understanding him. The work of love, in this context, included the work of understanding what had been lost and what had been left, and finding a way to be with someone who carried that, and who needed sometimes to carry it without being asked to put it down. The cancer diagnosis that Kate disclosed in March 2024 was preceded by weeks of public speculation about her health and her absence from public duties following abdominal surgery in January. The speculation was not always kind, and some of it was not always responsible, and the experience of watching it unfold, of being the subject of theories and rumors while genuinely unwell and trying to manage a serious medical situation, must have been, by any honest assessment, very difficult. She handled it by choosing her moment, filming a video message that she recorded herself, speaking directly to the public in terms that were honest without being exhaustive, and establishing control of her own narrative in a way that Diana would have recognized as important, even if the technology for doing it had not existed in Diana's time. The response to her disclosure was one of genuine warmth and concern that demonstrated something that had not always been visible, that Kate, who had spent years being criticized for being too controlled and too private and insufficiently warm compared to her predecessor, had in fact built a real relationship with the British public. The concern people felt for her was not the performed concern of media obligation, but something that looked more like genuine feeling, the feeling you have for someone you have come to know over time, even at a distance, and whose well-being you find you actually care about. The recovery has been handled with the same combination of discretion and strategic disclosure that has characterized her public life generally. She has returned to public duties gradually, carefully, on her own schedule, without allowing the pressure of royal expectation to override the requirements of her health. This is something that Diana struggled to do. Diana was rarely able to put her own needs ahead of the demands of the role or the appetite of the public, and Kate's ability to do it reflects both the support system she has, a husband who clearly takes her well-being seriously, an institution that has learned from its past failures, and the strength of character she has developed over 2 decades in one of the most scrutinized positions in the world. The title of this video, "The Crown Never Fits," is borrowed from a phrase that captures something essential about what both of these women have experienced, but it is worth complicating the metaphor slightly. The crown doesn't fit anyone perfectly. It never has. It is an artifact of a system that was built over centuries for purposes that have little to do with the actual well-being of the people required to wear it, and it presses in different places on different people and produces different kinds of damage and different kinds of resilience. Diana's damage was of one kind, Kate's resilience is of another, and comparing them two directly misses the extent to which they are different people in different situations, responding with the resources available to them. What they share is the experience of being placed inside an institution that had very specific ideas about what they were for, and of having to figure out, with varying degrees of support and varying degrees of self-knowledge, how to remain human within it. This is not a small thing. It is, arguably, one of the central challenges of certain kinds of public life, the maintenance of personhood under conditions designed to reduce you to a function. And watching two women navigate it across 2 generations is instructive about both the women and the institution and the ways in which both have and have not changed. Diana changed the monarchy by being impossible to manage, by insisting on her own reality even at the cost of everything the institution had to offer. Kate has changed it, more quietly but perhaps more durably, by demonstrating that it is possible to be inside the institution and to be genuinely yourself if you are patient enough and strategic enough and have the right kind of support. Neither approach is without cost. Neither is a complete solution to the fundamental problem that the institution asks more than any human being can fully give. But both women, in their different ways, have shown something important, that the person inside the role matters, that the warmth and the care and the genuine human connection that Diana brought to her work, and that Kate has continued in her own quieter way, are not incidental to the function of the monarchy, but are in fact the thing that makes the function worth anything. Without the person, the crown is just an object. Without the human being who wears it and who makes real contact with real people in real situations, the institution is just a system. It is the women and the men, but in this story it is the women who make it something more than that. The night of Diana's funeral, a candle was left burning in the window of Kensington Palace where she had lived. It burned all night. In the morning it was still there. Small details like this accumulate, over time, into something that outlasts the person they are associated with, a sense of presence, of ongoing significance, of meaning that refuses to be fully extinguished. Diana is that kind of presence in British life and in the life of the family she joined and left and changed, and in the life of the woman who wears her ring and raises her grandchildren and carries her, in whatever way it is possible to carry someone you never met, but whose life shaped yours in ways that can't be fully traced. Kate Middleton grew up watching Diana. She fell in love with Diana's son. She wore Diana's ring to her own wedding. She has spent 20 years in the role that Diana's life and death helped to redefine. And she has done this with a grace and a steadiness and a genuine human warmth that, whatever else you might say about it, represents a real achievement, not just in public relations terms, but in the terms that matter most, the terms of a life actually lived, of a family actually built, of a person actually preserved inside a role that has not always made preservation easy. The charity work that both women have done deserves extended consideration, because it is one of the areas where the comparison between them is most revealing, and where the continuity between their approaches is most apparent. Diana's charitable work was, as I have already noted, genuinely transformative, not just in terms of the causes she championed, but in terms of what it demonstrated about the potential of celebrity and royal status to shift public opinion and government policy. She raised awareness of landmines at a time when the international community was beginning to move toward the Ottawa Treaty banning them. She changed the public conversation about HIV and AIDS with a directness that was radical by the standards of the time. She sat with people who were dying in hospices and hospitals and homeless shelters, and she made them feel seen in a way that the official machinery of charitable giving rarely manages to do. What she discovered through this work was that the connection itself was the gift, that her presence, her attention, her willingness to touch and to listen and to sit with people in their difficult circumstances was more valuable than any check she could sign. This was a discovery that came from her own emotional history, from her own experience of feeling unseen and uncared for within an institution that was very good at managing people and considerably less good at actually caring for them. She gave to others what she had not received, and she gave it with a generosity that the people on the receiving end recognized as real. Kate's work on early childhood development is different in character, but similar in its underlying commitment to genuine engagement rather than ceremonial presence. She has spent years building expertise in this area, not just attending events and having her photograph taken with children, but actually learning, consulting with researchers and practitioners, developing a genuine understanding of the evidence base around early childhood development and what it means for the rest of a person's life. The Royal Foundation Center for Early Childhood, which she launched in 2021, is a substantive piece of work that is engaged with academics and policymakers and has produced research that has been taken seriously by people in the field. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, the thing that Diana was always trying to do with her own work, to make the royal platform do something real, to use the attention that came with the position to create actual change rather than just to generate positive press. Kate has done this in a quieter and more methodical way than Diana did, without the dramatic gestures and the global headlines. But the underlying intention is recognizable and the achievement is real. The children of both unions, Diana's sons William and Harry, Kate's children George, Charlotte, and Louis, represent another dimension of this story that is worth reflecting on. Diana was fiercely protective of her boys in ways that the institution sometimes found difficult to accommodate. She wanted them to have experiences of normal life. She took them to McDonald's. She took them to theme parks. She tried to show them the world outside the palace bubble in whatever ways were available to her. She did this because she believed it mattered for who they would become, and she was right about this, even though her ability to implement it was always limited by the circumstances of their lives. Kate has continued this approach with her own children, in a context that is both more supportive and more consciously thought through. The decision to send George and Charlotte to a relatively ordinary school, not one of the grand, expensive boarding schools that have traditionally educated royal children, was a deliberate choice about the kind of childhood they would have and the kind of people they might become. The careful management of their public presence, the limited number of official photographs, the decision not to exploit them for publicity, the protection of their school and their friendships and their daily lives from press intrusion, reflects lessons learned from Diana's era about what children of very public parents need to have a chance at a normal inner life. Harry's departure from royal duties and from Britain in 2020, and the memoir and the interviews that followed, introduced a new and complicated chapter into this story, one that is still unfolding and that it is too early to fully assess. What Harry said about his experiences within the family, about the treatment of Meghan, about the ways in which the institution had failed to protect them as it had failed to protect Diana, reopened questions that many people had hoped were settled and made visible fault lines that had been papered over rather than repaired. William's response, the public silence that has largely characterized his position, reflects both the genuine complexity of the situation and the specific way that he and Kate have chosen to navigate it, which is to remain within the institution and to work within its constraints rather than to challenge them from outside. This choice, to stay, is itself a reflection of lessons learned. Diana tried to stay and was eventually forced out, not by a formal decision, but by the accumulation of incompatibilities that made staying unsustainable. Harry tried to stay and eventually concluded that staying was costing more than he was willing to pay. William and Kate have stayed so far, and the staying has required its own compromises and its own forms of resilience, its own decisions about what to absorb and what to resist and what to simply outlast. The monarchy itself has changed around them during these years, changed in ways that Diana helped to force and that have made it, in some respects, a different institution from the one she married into. The conversations about mental health that Diana began, that William has continued with genuine commitment, and that Kate has amplified through her early childhood work, have changed the way the institution talks about its own members and the pressures they face. The conversations about race that Meghan's treatment brought to the surface have been more difficult and less resolved, but they have happened in a way that was not possible in Diana's era. The public's relationship with the monarchy is more complicated now, more conditional, more questioning, more aware of the human cost of the institution than it was when Diana walked down the aisle in 1981. None of these changes erases the fundamental tension at the heart of what we have been discussing. The tension between the institution's need for its members to be symbols and those members' need to be people. This tension has not been resolved by the changes of the last 30 years. It has been acknowledged more openly and managed more carefully and understood more clearly, but it is still there, still producing its specific forms of cost and resilience in the people who inhabit the positions it creates. Diana and Kate have navigated this tension differently, with different tools and different outcomes and different legacies. Diana's legacy is the more dramatic one. The images of her in Angola, the panorama interview, the flowers outside Kensington Palace, the two boys walking behind the coffin. But Kate's legacy is still being written, in the choices she makes about how to use her position and how to protect her family and how to remain herself inside a role that has consumed others. It is too early to know what the full measure of that legacy will be. What we can say is that both women have contributed to a shift in what the monarchy can be and what it is understood to be. A shift from an institution that required its members to subordinate everything personal to the demands of the role, toward one that is, very slowly, very imperfectly, beginning to recognize that the personal and the professional are not actually separable, and that attempting to treat them as if they were produces the kind of damage that becomes impossible to manage once it has fully accumulated. This is not a triumphant story. It is not a story of progress smoothly achieved or lessons cleanly learned. It is a story of damage and resilience and the specific kind of love that persists in difficult circumstances, of women who have tried to be themselves inside a system that was not built for them, of an institution that has changed less than it should and more than it wanted to, of two specific people who have been asked to carry a weight that no person should have to carry alone, and who have managed, in different ways and with different degrees of success, to carry it anyway. The crown never fits, but people put it on anyway. And in the putting on, and in the wearing, and in the choices they make about what to keep of themselves and what to sacrifice, they reveal something about who they are and what they value and what they are willing to endure in service of something larger than themselves. Diana and Kate have both made these revelations, in their different ways, before an audience of billions. What that audience has made of what it has seen, the conclusions it has drawn, the judgments it has reached, the compassion it has or has not extended, says as much about us as it says about them. That is all for tonight. I hope this gave you something to sit with. Two women, one crown, and the different ways that people find to be themselves inside circumstances that were not designed with their humanity in mind. These are not simple stories, and there are no simple conclusions, and I think that is probably how it should be. If you made it this far, thank you. A like, a comment, a subscription, it all means more than you might think for a small channel like this one. It is how these stories reach the people they are meant for. Sleep well. The crown is heavy, but tonight you don't have to wear it. I will see you in the next one. The fashion dimension of both women's public lives is worth spending some time on because it is often dismissed as superficial when it is actually deeply revealing. Clothes, in the context of royal life, are not personal expression in the ordinary sense. They are communication, carefully considered and strategically deployed in a context where every choice will be analyzed and every detail will be noted. Diana understood this intuitively and used it to extraordinary effect. She worked with designers who understood her needs and her instincts, who helped her create looks that were simultaneously appropriate for official functions and expressive of something genuine about who she was. Her style evolved dramatically over the years of her marriage, from the ruffled, rather girlish clothes of the early 1980s to the sleek, confident, deliberately glamorous clothes of the mid-1990s. And this evolution tracked her internal journey with a precision that was partly coincidental and partly the result of a woman who was increasingly clear about who she was and how she wanted to present herself to the world. Kate's fashion has been analyzed with similar intensity and with similar insights about what it communicates. She has been accused at various points of playing it too safe, of choosing clothes that are appropriate and pretty and entirely unrisky, that never make a bold statement or challenge expectations. This criticism is partly fair and partly misses the point. Kate's fashion choices are not about personal expression in the way that Diana's sometimes were. They are about reassurance, about communicating through the language of clothes that she is someone who can be trusted, who understands the requirements of the role, who will not surprise or embarrass or make headlines for the wrong reasons. This is a deliberate strategy, and it has served its purpose, and the occasional surprising choice, a bold color, an unexpected silhouette, is more striking for being set against a background of reliable elegance. Both women have used their fashion choices to support British designers, and later for Kate, to support designers from the Commonwealth countries she visits. This is not purely charitable. It makes political and diplomatic sense, but it also reflects a genuine interest in the industry and a real commitment to using the platform in ways that are beneficial beyond the purely personal. Diana's relationship with designers like David Emanuel, Catherine Walker, and Gianni Versace was personal as well as professional. Kate's relationship with designers like Alexander McQueen and Jenny Packham is more formal, but no less considered. Both have understood that the way they dress is part of the work, not a distraction from it. The physical toll of royal public life on both women has been documented, though with very different emphases. Diana's struggle with bulimia, which she discussed in the Panorama interview, was partly a response to stress, and partly, as she herself suggested, a response to the feeling of having no control over anything in her life except what she put in her mouth. The illness was serious and was not well understood or well treated during the years she was most affected by it, and the public visibility of her physical appearance, the constant photographing, the constant commentary on how she looked, made it both more difficult to manage and eventually more visible to the people around her. Kate's health challenges have been different in kind, but are also connected to the pressures of her position. The hyperemesis gravidarum, severe pregnancy sickness, that she experienced during all 3 of her pregnancies required hospitalization and was a reminder that behind the managed appearances and the careful communications was a body that was not always cooperating with the demands of the role. The cancer treatment of 2024 was a more serious challenge, one that required her to step back from public duties for several months, and that gave the public an unusually direct view of her vulnerability. That she handled it with the dignity and the control that she did is a reflection of her character. That she had to handle it publicly at all, that her illness was a news story before she had chosen to make it one, is a reflection of the impossible conditions in which she lives her life. There is a question that comes up repeatedly in discussions of Diana and Kate, and that is worth addressing directly. Is it possible to be both a fully realized person and a successful royal? Diana's story suggests that it is extremely difficult, that the institution's demands and the person's needs are in fundamental tension in ways that cannot be fully resolved through better management or more support. Kate's story suggests that it is possible, within limits, if the person has the right kind of temperament, and the right kind of support, and the right kind of understanding of what the institution requires. But even Kate's story includes the cancer diagnosis, and the months of illness, and the experience of losing control of her own narrative, even briefly, in ways that suggest the tension is never fully resolved. The answer, probably, is that it is possible to manage the tension, to find a sustainable accommodation between the person and the role, but not to eliminate it. The crown always costs something. The question is what it costs, and whether what it purchases in return is worth the price. And each person inside the institution has to answer that question for themselves, in full knowledge of what others have paid before them, and with whatever resources they have available to pay it themselves. One of the most striking aspects of the public response to both Diana and Kate across the decades has been the way that women in particular have related to them, with a mix of admiration and identification and criticism that reflects the complexity of what both women represent. Diana was many things to many women: an aspirational figure, a cautionary tale, a mirror for their own experiences of feeling unseen within institutions and relationships that were supposed to support them. The intensity of the grief at her death was, in significant part, the grief of women who recognized something of themselves in her story, and who felt, when she died, that something of their own experience had died with her. Not just a person, but a possibility, a way of being female in public that was warm and real and imperfect and genuine. Kate has inspired a different and somewhat more complicated female response. She is admired for her composure and her elegance and her apparent success in navigating an impossible position. She is also criticized, sometimes harshly, for being too controlled, too careful, too unwilling to take the risks that Diana took. These criticisms reflect a genuine ambivalence about what female success in constrained circumstances should look like, whether the goal is to work within the system as effectively as possible or to push against it in ways that might change it, or whether these options are even as different as they appear. Diana pushed against the system, and the system ultimately destroyed her. Kate works within it and maintains herself. Neither outcome is unambiguously desirable, and the choice between them is not as free as the criticism of Kate's approach sometimes implies. What both women share, beneath all the differences, is the experience of being loved by an enormous number of people they will never meet, of having their lives observed and interpreted and felt by strangers who have made them part of the landscape of their own emotional lives. This is a strange form of connection, not really reciprocal, and not really based on actual knowledge of the people involved, but real in its consequences, and real in the demands it places on the people at the center of it. Diana knew this, and was both nourished and overwhelmed by it. Kate knows it and manages it with the careful, deliberate attention she brings to everything else in her public life. The story of Diana and Kate is not finished, because Kate is still here and her story is still being written. But it is far enough along to see the shape of it, to understand what she has built and what she has learned and what she has carried and what she has chosen to put down. She has built a family that appears genuinely stable and genuinely warm. She has learned to use the platform of her position in service of causes she genuinely cares about. She has carried the weight of comparison with Diana with more grace than anyone could reasonably have expected, and she has done it without either erasing Diana or being erased by her. She has chosen to remain and to continue, and to do the work with the dedication and the care that make the work worth doing. The sapphire ring, the one that Charles gave Diana in 1981, that sat on her finger through everything, that William gave to Kate 30 years later, is the most literal symbol of the continuity between these two stories. It is an extraordinary object to think about, a piece of jewelry that has passed from one generation's love to another, that carries the history of both and belongs fully to neither, that is worn every day by a woman who did not know the woman who wore it before her, but whose life is in so many ways shaped by that woman's choices and that woman's costs. Kate wears Diana's ring on her left hand, and does her work and raises her children and manages the impossible position with the steadiness that is her characteristic gift. Diana wore it through everything the first time, and now it is Kate's, and what it means that it has traveled from one hand to the other is something that both of them would understand, in their different ways, as containing more than can easily be said.